Hey there, art nerds. I have another start to finish tutorial for you guys today. Today, since it is the spooky season, we are going to be drawing a little mushroom witch. So I hope you guys are looking forward to it because I'm really excited to share this one with you guys. If you just want to color along, I have printable line arts over on my Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. You'll also find the materials used for this tutorial listed out down in the description below, as well as links to other tutorials that you guys might find helpful. So grab your pencils, grab your brush pens, and grab your watercolors, and let's get painting. So as with all my start to finish tutorials, we are going to start with a sketch. I have the thumbnail of the illustration that I have in mind over to the right, and I'm just kind of roughly blocking everything in. I went ahead and divided the paper in half, both horizontally and vertically, to help me find the center because we're going to do a central themed composition today. I drew a large circle around that, and then within that, I'm starting to block out the figure of our little mushroom witch. And I apologize that it is kind of hard to see what I'm doing. I'm drawing with red lead because it is water soluble. It'll kind of disappear when we add watercolor on top of it, but it's also strong enough to show up on the camera as compared to some of the other colors that I have available and that I like to use. If you're looking for more tutorials on how to draw figures, particularly cartoony figures, I've got playlists that will help you do just that. So make sure you check the description down below. Once I have everything kind of blocked in, and I use kind of a modified stick figure to block the figure in, I can start refining the forms and breaking down the face in half so that I can more easily place the features. I received a request for a tutorial on how I think about drawing clothing, and it's pretty similar to how I think about drawing figures. I am using volumetric perspective or volumetric drawing to kind of block in the basic shapes of her outfit. I'm also referencing a few things like dirndl skirts for this, but if it's something that I've drawn a lot or have referenced a lot or own and wear myself, I may not need to reference it. So I use kind of a triangular shape to block in her skirt, and then I add some upward curved scallops down at the bottom to imply folds. And I connect the highest point of the scallop kind of going back up to the waistband of the dress so we can better imply that there are folds going on. I'm also going to draw a triangular shape to imply that there is an apron, as well as a triangular hat for her witch's hat with this kind of, let's say, Pringles shaped brim for the hat brim. It's a little bit difficult to see and it can be kind of challenging to imagine. So my best advice when you're drawing clothing or you're learning how to draw clothes is you reference them as much as possible. The Sartorialist and Pinterest can be great places to find interesting outfits that you may want to practice drawing in your sketchbook. So the more you study from reference and the more you practice it, the easier it's going to get. But if you guys would like to see another tutorial on how I think about drawing clothing, or if you'd like me to do that as a live stream, please let me know that down in the comments below. So now that I've got her kind of blocked in loosely, I still haven't added the details to the face. I am starting to kind of block in the mushrooms that she's holding, as well as the mushrooms behind her. And I'm also blocking in her hair. And for this start to finish girl, I wanted her to have more wavy hair since we haven't really done that a whole lot in our start to finish figurative, because we have drawn some animals and we've drawn just some mushrooms as well. I haven't really drawn wavy hair yet as the start to finish tutorial, so I figured I would do that here. So one thing I want you guys to notice is that I am basically developing the details kind of all at the same pace. I'm not spending a lot of time or energy really fleshing out and developing one area and kind of leaving the rest still sketchy, because if I have to do a lot of erasing or if I have to do a lot of repositioning, it's going to save me a lot of work if I haven't spent a lot of effort already tightening it up and penciling it in. So I basically developed my illustrations little bit by a little bit by a little bit. And with this red lead, it becomes a little bit harder to erase if you bear down too hard on it. It's easier to erase while it's still really hard to see and sketchy, and it's more likely to just disappear into the watercolors. So I do all of my initial placement and figuring things out very light and very sketchy. And then once I kind of like where things are going, then I'll go in and kind of tighten up those lines so you guys can see them a little bit better. Another thing is that I'm not showing you guys just how much I'm erasing the guidelines once I don't need them anymore. Mostly because when I erase, it makes the camera shake, and that gives everybody motion sickness, so we don't really need to see that. But just keep in mind, as I'm going, I am erasing guidelines that I no longer need, so that I'm not trying to do that after everything's gotten really fleshed out, and I might end up erasing something that I want to keep. So you guys might notice with the face, I have kind of waited to erase the guidelines until I had the features in there, and then I can start erasing things. I also want to go ahead and point out that this video has been time-lapsed by at least 4x, and some segments have been time-lapsed by 6x or by 8x to try and get it under the hour mark. Usually for the start to finish tutorials, I feel like 4x is as fast as I want to go because it's very easy to miss a lot of details, and 4x really allows me to walk you guys through my process a little bit better. But some of these things are things that we do over and over and over again throughout this series, so I felt like there were some areas where we could just move a little bit faster. I am planning on inking this sketch before we start painting, but if you would like to do the invisible line art technique, you can actually start painting once you're satisfied with your sketch. The only difference is it's going to be harder to see that underlying sketch, and I wanted to have a line art that I could share with my patrons. But if you want to go ahead and start painting without waiting for the ink to cure to the paper, that is also an option. So I'm also kind of going in with a finer eraser. It's like one of the mono thinner erasers. I use a variety of really small erasers to kind of get in there and erase the excess lines, and I am doing just that with that eraser. So I'm trying to kind of clean up at this point as I go, because we're kind of in the final stretch of the sketch. We're adding in final details. I'm adding some lace scallops to the bottom of the apron. We're kind of adding some gills and some ribs to the mushrooms, and I'm just kind of tightening things up, thinking about what I want to add, and just trying to define everything just a little bit better now that everything has been kind of roughly sketched in and placed. Alright, so now we have our finished sketch. It is time to start inking, and I am using a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen for this. I put a nice cushy jelly grip on it since I do have some arthritis and it's a little bit easier on my hand. And this is a waterproof and alcohol marker safe brush pen. So what this means is it's going to allow me to do really, really thin light lines if I apply very little pressure, or if I bear down just a little bit more, I can get much thicker, heavier line weights. And I really love how versatile brush pens are and how easy they are to ink with. Basically, if you are looking for a variety of line weights, rather than bearing down on your fine liners and your felt tips, you might want to consider trying out a few different brush pens and seeing which one works well for you. So with inking, it is pretty much the same process every time. I'm kind of warming up my hand at this point. So I'm inking some of the mushrooms that are closer to the viewer down at the bottom, where if I make a mistake or I mess up, it's going to be less noticeable. And once I feel like my hand is warmed up, kind of limbered up, and I've kind of hit a flow state when it comes to inking, I'm going to move on to her face, because that is one of the most important parts of the illustration. It's also the point where if I mess it up, you're going to notice it the most. So I want to make sure my hand is warmed up before I start inking it, but I don't want to wait so long that my hand is tired or that I'm feeling kind of fatigued. So you want to kind of hit that middle zone for inking the most important things. If there's anything overlapping her face though, I want to make sure that I ink that first. I like to work from foreground to background when it comes to inking. It's easier for me, it makes more sense, and it also allows me to kind of evaluate the line weights that I'm using. If you're not familiar with the term line weight, that just means the width of the line that we are using. So lightweight objects like feathers and clouds would have a very light, fine line weight. Heavy objects like rocks and elephants would have a heavier line weight, kind of implying their mass and their weight. Items that are darker might have a heavier line weight. Items in shadow might have a heavier line weight where the shadow is to imply the shadow. Items that are closer to the viewer might have a heavier line weight so that they appear closer, and items that are further away in the distance might have a lighter line weight, implying they're a little bit hazy and a little bit difficult to see. We're utilizing a little bit of atmospheric perspective when we do that. Items like hair might be very lightly inked because hair can be a very lightweight thing, but if you're inking darker hair, you may want to go ahead and fill it in with black or even draw more of the individual strands to give it that darker color. The beautiful thing about inking is there's a variety of ways that you can approach it, and you can really make it have its own personality, and it's a great way to really impress your style upon your art. Now, I am a comic artist. I really like comics and cartoons, and I have a cartoonier art style. So I really lean heavily into these very bouncy, somewhat dynamic line weights for my inking. But if you are drawing, inking, and painting along with me today, please feel free to use whatever materials and whatever inking style you wish. If you even want to modify this to make it your own, I highly encourage you to do so. This is just my take on this topic, and I would love to see what you come up with. So I'm just kind of quietly working my way around this. Generally, when I'm working in my studio, my husband is actually working in the studio behind me. He is a programmer, so we typically work in the same room. And generally, I like to chat with him, but if I'm inking, I'm usually listening to music or listening to a podcast or doing something very quiet because a lot of my inking is pulled with my breath. So what this means is if I am breathing in, I am pulling a line towards me. If I am breathing out, I am probably pulling a line towards me. And I rotate the paper so that it is in a position that is the most comfortable for my wrist. So that's why you guys see my sketchbook just flipping and flopping all over the place, because I'm really trying to get an angle that is most comfortable for me. And if you're not recording, I recommend you do this for the entire process. You can do it for the sketch, you can do it for the inks, and you can do it for the painting. But since I am recording, I find it the most beneficial to do it with the inks so that we can get these really nice, clean lines. Now, inking can take quite a bit of practice to get comfortable and confident with it, so please don't feel bad if it is an area of weakness. It's just something to keep working on as you go, and we all have areas that we would like to continue to grow and polish and shine, and to continue to seek inspiration from other artists so that we can learn new skills. We're all working kind of collaboratively in that we have the internet to inspire us and to also provide information and resources when we need it. So I encourage you to avail yourself of those resources as you're doing right now, hanging out with me today, watching this start to finish art tutorial. But I encourage you to continue to use those resources to help you grow as an artist, whether you just enjoy making art for fun or you're interested in doing it on a more professional level and would like to make money from it. We can all continue to learn and grow as we live, and that's one of the beautiful things about being alive, is that there's always new things to learn and always new ways that we can improve. Once you are finished inking, I recommend that you let the inks cure to the paper for 24 hours before you start painting. If you would like to skip this step and just paint along with me, I shared the printable line art with printing instructions over on my Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup as a thank you for all their support. So today I am painting with my Daily Driver watercolor palette. You guys see the ginormous watercolor palette here. And I am going to start by painting the background. And I want one of those like really high blue October skies that we get down here in Southeast Louisiana. So I am mixing a little bit of ultramarine blue with some cobalt and maybe just a little bit of cerulean blue. So we get this really bright true blue color that also granulates just a little bit. And I am going to fill the background with this blue. That's why we left that red circle, so I can see what I'm doing. And it's basically going to disappear into the watercolor. And I am using a smaller quill to do this, but a larger round would work just fine. Typically, when I'm painting, I like to use rounds because they are good all-rounders and they work well for the kind of art which is more figurative and storytelling kind of art that I like to do. I tend to have a tighter, more rendered, more mannered art style, but if you are one of my loose watercolor friends, I would love to see your take on this. I think that would just be so stinking cute and so charming. So please, if you paint along with me and you have one of those looser art styles, I would love to see what you make. So one of the tricks for getting as smooth a wash as you possibly can on a cellulose paper, like what we're painting on today, is to make sure the area that you're painting is there's never that dry edge, because once you hit that dry edge, it's going to be a visible dry edge. I also will paint in sections and just worry about filling that section. So what I basically do, since we're painting on a cellulose paper today, is I leave a flooded, very wet edge and then just kind of work that into the next section like you guys see me doing here as I apply another layer of our blue mix to our sky background. Now that that's dried, I'm going to mix just a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm going to use that to fill her eyes and paint the top row of her mouth. I'm lifting a little bit of that out of the eyes, and this is going to be the whites of the eyes and indicate just a little bit of shadow. Next, I'm mixing up a Payne's Gray, probably from a convenience mix, and I'm going to use this to do a little bit of grisé underpainting. So I'm painting in the shadows on our mushrooms using the Payne's Gray, and I'm using a smaller round for this. I'm going to mix my Payne's Gray just a little bit more saturated, and I'm going to start painting the caps on some of the mushrooms. And I'm working heavily from reference. These are all real mushrooms, even if I can't name them all. Eventually, I will get to that point. I am just not there yet. And we're basically painting in the shadows of these mushrooms, and we're also pushing them a little bit further into the background by using this gray wash. The colors are not going to be quite as bright as the objects, the people in the foreground. So this is a really helpful skill to have. So now I'm mixing up a little bit of an ochre color, and I am going to use this to just paint the entire fly agate here. So I am going to use masking fluid to mask out the scales on the mushroom's cap a little bit later on, but I want to make sure that they aren't just the white of the paper. So I'm using this kind of tanned mix so that that doesn't happen, so that we have a little bit of color to them. I'm also going to paint some of the smaller foreground mushrooms with this color as well. This is kind of a useful all-rounder mushroom color because it's light enough that you can paint over it, so it can kind of serve as a base color, and it just kind of adds a woodsy, more neutral base. And a lot of mushrooms do have quite a bit of brown either in the stems or in the gills. Again, depending on the mushroom, I recommend you reference this. That's what I'm doing. So it just kind of is a good base layer for all these mushrooms. I let that layer dry. I'm going to mix it a little bit more saturated, maybe with some burnt sienna added to the mix, and then do another layer, just kind of building that color up. So one of the things about cellulose paper, and I am painting in my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. A big part of the start to finish tutorial series for me is for me to use my watercolor sketchbooks and have these kind of fun, very easy, shorter tutorials to share with you guys. But it's also a very affordable paper that you can find a lot of places. It does have a lot of limitations, but you can make some really fun and pretty art on your cellulose paper if you know how to make it work for you. It's not going to be able to take as many layers or as much water as a cotton rag paper, but you can still do some of the tricks that you can do on your cotton rag paper on cellulose paper. Cellulose paper is usually marketed as a student grade paper, and I would generally recommend that you avoid it if you're learning watercolor techniques because it doesn't do everything that cotton rag paper does, and it actually requires handling a little bit differently than you would if you're used to using a cotton rag. I think it's got its place, but I think it has a different place than, say, a student grade paper. So I'm using a turquoise blue to paint some of the moss down here at the bottom. For this, you can use whatever colors you like, whatever colors that make your heart sing. I just wanted to kind of mix up the moss colors from what I typically use because usually I grab for undersea green pretty early on. I'm also adding in some more of our Payne's gray to shade our fly agate, as well as I think they are oyster mushrooms in the background. I've grabbed a little bit of burnt sienna and I'm going to start working it into the stem of this larger mushroom, kind of following along with the striations and just adding a little bit of color, blending it out with a little bit of water as we go so it's not too harsh or too striking early on. I'm going to lift some up with a paper towel if I find it to be too harsh or if it's moved more than I would like it to, and then I can blend that out with water as well. I'm going to add another layer of our kind of tannish color to the cap, creating a wet base. And then I'm going to quickly grab some burnt sienna and dab that onto the cap sporadically so that it blends out wet into wet. And again, I want to reiterate that I am working using photo reference so that I know what these mushrooms look like. I can't impress that heavily enough. This isn't a copy exactly what I'm doing sort of thing. This is more of a kind of take what I'm doing and look at the reference that you found and interpret it. And I'm trying to show you guys how I'm thinking about it, if it makes sense. For any of these kind of illustrations, I am probably using reference to paint the natural world. And as I'm working on my Easily Influenced series and I'm reading a lot of how-to watercolor books by influential and popular artists, I have to say I do not see enough of them talk about referencing enough. So I am going to belabor that point because I really want to normalize referencing and normalize mentioning that you're referencing. I think they are doing their audience a disservice by not. So I'm going to use a little bit of our Payne's gray in a slightly darker shade, and I'm going to start painting in the shadows on the mushrooms that she's holding. Also, if you drew these little like loops and open areas in her hair, make sure that you paint the mushrooms from behind that as well so it's visible. So with the little button mushrooms closer to the foreground, I'm doing a layer of our tannish color, and then I'm dabbing in a little bit of burnt umber, wet into wet, and letting it diffuse. And then I'll grab a little bit more saturated burnt umber and dab that in at the top, allowing it to kind of diffuse out towards the bottom. I'm going to move on over to the left and start working on the fly agate mushroom again. I'm adding a little bit of shadow using Payne's Gray, especially to the collar as well as to the gills. And I also want to imply some shadow from the mushrooms and from the girl in front of it. I'm going to grab a little bit more Payne's Gray and just continue to add some shadow to this group of mushrooms, particularly the oyster mushroom. And the Payne's Gray is a really nice color for adding these kind of underpainting shadows. Neutral tint, depending on whose neutral tint, can also be really good for this, but I find neutral tint tends to desaturate what you paint on top of it a lot more than I would like. But with the Payne's Gray, it can add a nice little shadow color that I can then paint on top of. And since not all watercolor, but most of watercolor, especially with the way I paint with loads of really thin layers and wet into wet washes, you can still see some of that shadow through the subsequent layers, and it just kind of does a nice job of implying that shadow so I don't have to try and glaze it on top of my painting later. I'm adding a thicker saturation of brown to the top of this large right hand mushroom as well as to the stem, trying to make sure that I pay attention to the striations on the stem. While that's drying, I'm going to grab some greens, and I think it might be chrome or chromium green. It really doesn't matter. Paint with a green that you like. This is just the one that I happen to grab. And I'm going to start filling in the moss down at the bottom. So one of the problems with cellulose paper is you guys can see the water just really wants to pool on the surface. So unlike a cotton rag paper, which will absorb the water, with cellulose, the paint and the water is just going to sit on the surface of the paper. It's never really going to soak in, and the pigments are never really going to get caught in the fibers of the paper the way they might with some cotton rag watercolor papers. So it's different dry times. With cellulose can either take very, very little time to dry. That's why I'm actually doing these little mini tutorials in the sketchbook, is they're very quick for me to do. This took about 4 hours of active painting time, or about 3 days, with the sketch and the ink being 1 day and then the painting being the next 2 days. So it's a little bit quicker for me to paint. It also can only take so many layers. So it kind of allows me to do these mini tutorials with you guys a little bit quicker and not overwork my painting as much as I might if it were on cellulose paper. So I have pulled out my masking fluid. I have Winsor & Newton removable masking fluid in a small glass vial that I got from Dollar Tree. And working with a smaller container of masking fluid means that it's not open for as long, so it's less likely to rot, which saves you money in the long run. I also find the little container just easier to use and less likely to spill. And even if it did spill, it's less masking fluid to clean up in the long run. I am using a small synthetic round, and I have worked some brush soap into the bristles while the bristles were wet. So I wet the bristles and then I worked some brush soap in. And then I'm using my masking fluid, and the brush soap actually prevents your brush from sucking up the masking fluid into the metal ferrule, effectively ruining your watercolor brush. I would still recommend that you don't use brushes that you particularly love for this, and I do find that synthetic bristles being slicker and more slippery than natural or mixed fiber brushes, it's easier to get the masking fluid out of those brushes. They are also cheaper, so if I ruin one, it's not going to break my heart. So I've applied my masking fluid, and I'm going to allow it to dry fully before I start painting our fly agaric, which means I'm going to spend a little bit of time working on some of the other mushrooms in the illustration and adding some details. And I'm mostly working with browns and neutrals for the mushrooms on the right hand side. I did mix a little bit of Payne's Gray with what looks like sepia to paint the caps of the oyster mushrooms. If you guys are looking at your reference, as I surely hope you are, you'll notice that these mushrooms do have a grayish brown or a brownish gray cap, and that's what I'm trying to replicate here. Almost all of the mushrooms that I've chosen to paint for this illustration fall into a neutral palette, and I'm going to try to offset and contrast that with the colors that I use for our little witch here. So we've got a lot of more somber, less exciting browns, but we can kind of use that to create some excitement and contrast with the colors that we choose to paint our character with. I'm still really thinking about what color palette I want for the witch, so I'm just going to work on painting and referencing the mushrooms and save her color palette for a little bit later on in this illustration. So for the next layer of our moss, I'm going to grab some more of the base green that I use, but it's much more concentrated. It doesn't have as much water in it. And I'm using little M-shaped strokes to kind of give the impression of moss, making sure to leave little islands of our base color still visible to serve as the highlight. I really love the bright, fun colors of fly agaric, so this is one of my favorite parts. I have grabbed a warm yellow, and I'm going to paint the whole cap with this color. While it's still wet, I'm going to grab some scarlet red, and I am going to paint most but not all of the cap with this color. And I am so sorry, I did not record myself doing the larger one, but basically we're going for kind of an ombre effect. While I wait for those caps to dry, I'll start working on adding some more detail and more layers to our moss. So I'm doing another layer of kind of our turquoise blue. I wanted something originally that would kind of demonstrate all the beautiful variety of color that we can get from moss, and that would add a little bit of contrast because with this series I paint a lot of moss. I hope you guys like moss as much as I do. And if you don't, pretend it's grass, I guess. But I used a turquoise for that, and then I was starting to feel like everything was very primary colory. So I wanted to think about that for a little while. I also decided that I needed to make the background sky a little bit darker, and our initial mix has had a chance to evaporate some, which means it's going to saturate some more. So I'm doing another layer of our ultramarine blue and cobalt blue sky, particularly at the top, and that's going to give the impression of a bit of an ombre effect where the top is going to be darker than the lower areas on the illustration without doing a whole lot of work, because if you guys will notice, we basically just did that from like the tops of the mushrooms. We don't have to do any sort of blending by kind of hiding that transition line behind the mushrooms. I'm also going to do another layer of shading on our moss, and I've grabbed probably two mixed colors. Probably that's looking like undersea green now that I look at it. I am such a creature of habit. And we're still doing our little M shapes. And one of the things I really like about Daniel Smith's undersea green is it's this beautiful granulating color that in mass tone looks like a green, but it's really got indigos and golds and a little bit of brown in it. I've used some Chinese watercolor weights to hold my page down. Y'all, these things are so great, especially if you don't want to use tape or a clip. These things are awesome. I will have them linked down in the description below. You guys really need to try them out. And then I am adding the same undersea green to our turquoise blue moss because I wanted to better blend in with the rest of the moss, and it was just standing out too much. It was looking too primary colory-y to me. So this is me attempting to solve the problem and just make it look like it belongs with the illustration a little bit more. You guys can tell that time has definitely passed, probably several hours, by how evaporated my paints are. That's one of the ways you guys can know that it takes me a while to paint these things, but also that I do take breaks and I very rarely sit down in the morning and finish an illustration by the evening. Just to be real, y'all, I am a night owl. I'm not a morning person. This, however, works in my favor because it means that I have more saturated colors to work with, which are great for the kind of painting we're doing today, where we're mostly working with local color. So for the tops of our mushrooms, I have grabbed some of our scarlet red. I am painting the tops. Maybe I'll dab a little extra off. And now I am grabbing alizarin crimson and adding it at the very tippy top of our mushrooms so it blends in with the scarlet. So we get that really beautiful color transition that you guys see with fly agaric. You guys see me paint fly agaric a lot. I think it is a beautiful mushroom and it's really inspiring just to look at, and I enjoy painting it. Much the same way that I enjoy painting flowers, I enjoy painting beautiful mushrooms. So you guys see me fuss around with the moss a lot, and I'm really just not satisfied with it. It's looking a little bit too color in the lines for me. So I'm going to spritz it with a little bit of clean water in a spritzer bottle just to encourage it to move around and to get just a little bit messy. And this is a technique that I use all the time to encourage my work to just kind of have a little bit more fun and not be so neat and tidy. I've also switched out for a clean ceramic palette. I put my initial palette up off to the side where I can still use it and still grab those colors, but I needed more space. So I have mixed up, honestly, knowing me, yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet red for her skin tone, although a very watered down burnt sienna will also work for lighter skin tones like this. I just want to remind you guys though, if you are painting along or coloring along with me at home, you can make this person whatever color your heart desires. I would love to see your take and your spin on this. So I wanted her to be a redhead because I don't think at this point we have any redheads in our start to finish tutorial series, and one of my really good friends is a redhead, so I wanted to give a little bit of redhead representation. So I am actually starting with probably Indian yellow. It is a beautiful color that as you work more saturated, it becomes much richer, and it's a really good base color for sort of redheads and ginger hair people. So I figured this would be a really good color for the base highlight, and I'm just kind of applying that all over. I'm going to add a little bit more because, as I mentioned earlier, as you work more saturated, the color really becomes a lot richer and you can really build up the tone. So I'm adding another layer to her skin tone, and one of the things I do with painting on cellulose paper, because it can only take so many layers and because the colors do sometimes look less saturated, more muddy, a little more chalky than they would on a cotton rag paper where they might look a little bit cleaner, is I am basically only going to be working with local color, and I'm only going to be working with different saturations of the same hue. So I'm not necessarily going to use red violet like I would normally use to shade skin tones. So I'm adding another layer to her hair, and now we're kind of moving into the gold territory. I may have even added some quinacridone gold to this. It's another really beautiful color that has quite a bit of shading and range to it. Another layer to her skin tone. Usually when we're working on really translucent colors like this, we can build up color depth by layering it. But if you're struggling to get the contrast and the shadow that you want, you can obviously mix the color darker or just wait and let time evaporate some of your color and increase the saturation for you. It might be a good opportunity to take a break, to touch some grass, to get some fresh air, and to look at the clouds. So this outfit is a little bit inspired by like German Alps folkwear. So I'm doing a blue jay feather in the brim of her hat. So we're starting with ultramarine blue. I dabbed in a thicker mix of ultramarine blue, and that just kind of took over. I added a little bit of burnt umber down at the bottom, and the two just refused to mingle or get along. So that's something that I'm going to have to address a little bit later, but maybe you will have happier painting than I did in that instance. And I have also added some orange. I believe it is either quinacridone burnt sienna or it is Chinese orange. Both are good colors. Quinacridone burnt sienna is much more translucent, so it makes sense that I would grab that. And I'm using that for our middle layer, the main base color of her hair. And you guys can see how by layering this on top of the yellows, we're able to build in highlights that feel like they make sense with this hair. My friend who has red hair has these really beautiful, like, goldish highlights to her hair. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about when I'm painting redheads. Our fly agaric has had a chance to dry, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the masking fluid using a masking fluid frisket or a masking fluid pickup. Some people can use their fingers. I find that I cannot. So you can find these down at Dollar Tree. You can also sometimes find them in the model painting section. It's basically a giant booger made up of dried masking fluid, and it works really well because latex wants to stick to latex, and it will basically gently pull it up for you without tearing it up too much. Using the tannish brown I mixed in the other palette, I'm just going to add that to some of the scales on the mushroom just to add a little bit of shadow and to just kind of blend them in with the mushroom a little bit better. You can also use the scarlet red just to kind of blend them into the mushroom in case you have any weird islands of masking fluid where the masking fluid escaped your line art. I'm going to paint the mushrooms in her hat brim to match the mushrooms that are kind of, you see those little bitty ones? There we go. Down by her feet. Oh, look, they match. And we're tying her to her environment. So I am mixing up, probably we are in the Quin burnt sienna zone, although it might be burnt sienna, or I may have even grabbed a little bit of scarlet, but I think it is Quin Burnt Sienna. And we're doing another layer on her hair. I will eventually move on to Burnt Sienna with her hair for the final shadows. We've already got some bright colors going on in her hat, and because I do want to reference kind of German alpine folkwear, I'm going with Payne's Gray for the base of her hat. So it's going to stand out against the blue of the sky, but it isn't necessarily going to detract from her hair or from the mushrooms behind her. And I have to admit, giving her red hair was kind of a difficult decision for me because we have those beautiful fly agaric mushrooms behind her, and it all does have a tendency to get kind of lost in one another. So for the underside of the hat brim, I did a little bit of a wet into wet with a slightly more saturated mix of our Payne's Gray. And one of the downsides to painting on cellulose paper is that sometimes when you do wet into wet, it can just flood the whole area and you can lose that beautiful gradient. But you know, you win some, you lose some, and one of the wins of working on this paper is that you can work a lot quicker, or at least I can work a lot quicker than if I were working on cotton rag. So I'm adding another layer to her skin, and this is going to be kind of a reoccurring struggle as I try to build up her skin tone dark enough and get enough contrast going on her skin that it looks like she actually has some shadow and there's some lighting going on. For some of the shadows in her hair, I'm going to use Van Dyke Brown, and I'm using around, and I'm really trying to keep my brush strokes moving in the direction of the hair mass that I'm painting at that time. And that's one of the really great things about rounds. They are super flexible. They are capable of some really nice sharp brush strokes. And if you enjoy working with alcohol markers, particularly brush tipped alcohol markers, rounds are going to be a natural choice should you decide to pick up watercolor. So now we've moved on to actually working on her and deciding on the colors that she's wearing in earnest, because we have painted basically everything else. So I've given this piece of advice before, but I still find it really helpful. If you don't know what color palette you want to use, paint the knowns first. So if you're painting real world objects, or if you know you want certain things to be certain colors, start blocking those in first, and you may find inspiration with painting contrasting or complementary colors to kind of accent what you're doing. So I wanted her little leaf bag to be recognizable as a leaf, so I went ahead and painted it sap green so that you guys would know it's supposed to be a leaf bag. And I've seen some very cute little cork leaf bags online that I'm gonna have to get myself one of these days. So for her top, I wanted it to appear white, so I'm using a really watered down wash of ultramarine blue. And I am not actually covering the whole area. I'm still leaving some of the white of the paper still visible. And this is where a round really shines. It's just so easy to get in there and let the brush do a lot of the work. And that's an area where I'm trying to grow and trying to progress as an artist, is trying to focus more on my brushwork, and instead of just filling things in and filling things in and filling things in, letting the brush make some natural shapes. This little sketchbook illustration has a lot of browns and a lot of red, but not necessarily a lot of green. So I decided to go with a hooker's green for her skirt. And I felt like this would add just a nice pop of contrast against the blue of the sky and the browns and the oranges that we have going on in the background. And while we do have moss, the dress is not actually directly against the moss, so we get a little bit of fun color play that hopefully pops her more into the foreground and also helps draw more attention to her. At the time, I felt like the hooker's green was looking a little bit basic, so I decided to pull a little bit of turquoise into the mix so that we get a nice rich blue-green or bluish green, because it's not really like a blue-green once we've layered the two and done a little bit of optical blending, right? So we get a nice bluish green for the skirt, and that makes it look a little bit richer and not quite so like primary color play, pops of color going on here. I'm still thinking about the hat ribbon and the ribbon on her dress and the boots, and while I'm kind of thinking about that, I'm gonna go ahead and just add some layers and add some shadows using local color to her apron and to her top and to her dress. Now to add some shadow to her dress, I've added a little bit more blue to our mix, and I'm going to start painting the shadows. And I want to make sure I leave some of the original green still visible, because that's going to be our highlight and that's going to help us build up the color. And it's also going to help create the illusion of form, and like the fabric here is actually bending and folding in space. I think it is sometimes a fair accusation to say that I am basic, and I decided to be basic here. We're going to go with red. This is probably alizarin crimson for the ribbon on her apron as well as for her socks, and just lean into the good old contrasting colors. I also decided to make the little coin pendant around her neck gold, since that would kind of pop against what we've got going on here, because we have a lot of Payne's gray already in the image, and I decided to make her hat band red as well. So for me, when I am struggling with color theory, I choose to kiss it. I keep it simple, stupid, and basically just work from 2 or 3 colors and maybe some analogous colors right next to them right in the color wheel. And you know, I used to kind of beat myself up for the fact that my color theory is not quite as strong as some of my artist friends are, but I have seen other artists get by with so much less and it still looks really awesome. So you know, why overthink it if you don't need it to be? Why overcomplicate things when sometimes simple works really well? So that is the excuse I'm gonna make today for this tutorial. But like I said before, feel free to use whatever colors make your heart sing, and to change and modify and play and explore, because if you can't do that on somebody else's line art, I don't know, man, that seems like permission to me to just play around, as when somebody else already did the drawing. You can just get free and kind of weird with it. So I decided to go with Payne's gray for her eyes and just kind of pull that back in. Also because I've been painting a lot of blue-eyed and green-eyed people lately, so you know, why not go with gray? And I am going to add another layer of our red, and that would be alizarin crimson to the red ribbon on the bottom. So we started with kind of a desaturated wash, and I'm filling in some but not all of it, and that creates the highlight on the ribbon because I kind of wanted to have the impression of a satin ribbon. And by leaving that nice sharp highlight, that really gives the impression of satin ribbon a little bit better than if we had just painted the whole thing in. So I am using the mix that I had left over from painting her hair. So it's kind of a reddish Van Dyke brown mix. And I'm using that for her boots. And I'm going to just keep working it a little bit darker and maybe a little bit redder from there. I also wanted to add some more shadow to the skirt of her dress. So I'm grabbing a little bit more of our kind of phthalo-ish green color. And I'm using that to paint in the shadows. And you know how it is with watercolor, we're going to cover less area with each layer than we covered with the layer before. And this is kind of a little way to create some contrast and to create some depth and definitely to create some shadow. For the next layer on our boots, we're going to grab a little bit of our Van Dyke brown and we're just going to add it in. And basically we're at the point where I'm just kind of adjusting the shadows, layering things, adding a little bit more contrast. We've got all of our base colors blocked in, so we kind of know where everything's going. And now is the point where we're just like trying to make sure our contrast is there and like everything's readable and that we have enough shadow that things feel like they're not just floating. They feel like they're grounded and they feel like they take place in the same reality. And this can take some practice. So this is the point where I just say it's zhuzhing. It's going to be your mileage may vary. Different people have different expectations for what they think finish should look like in their mind, how much contrast, how much shadow they want to see. And I'm basically just kind of adjusting and finessing things and adding additional shadow until it looks right. It's really hard to step by step this process because it's such a matter of taste. And it's really also a matter of who your inspirations are and what you're referencing and what you like to paint and your skill level, that it's kind of hard to walk people through this thing. Now, if you want to get better at watercolor, obviously you should be doing watercolor, but you should also be looking at watercolors and a wide variety of watercolors. And you should also look at other arts as well for inspiration and to see how people handle things and to see if you can recreate it in watercolor. The more art you consume and the more widely you consume art. So if you like loose watercolor florals, maybe you should try reading some comics. And if you like comics, maybe you should look at some abstract art. And if you like stained glass, maybe you should look at sculpture. That sort of thing. The more inspiration you take in, the more you're going to train your eye and the more you're going to be able to bring that into the type of art that you do. And just because I have a cartoony art style, that doesn't mean I only look at cartoony or more caricatured art. I look at a wide variety of art and a variety of artists. And I try to take what I see that I like from them and bring that into my own work or try to emulate some of the techniques that they might be using. We're all works in progress and we're all still growing, much as this illustration is still growing. I'm still adjusting things and finessing things and adding a little bit of contrast here or maybe adding some more highlight there. We're all on this journey to make art and grow as artists. And the more art that we enjoy, the better our own art will be. This step is totally optional. It's a matter of taste, but once the paint has dried, I decided to adjust the contrast just a little bit because sometimes when you paint with semi-opaque and opaque watercolors on top of a black or colored line art, it can make things start to look muddy as the contrast gets kind of skewed, because keep in mind that black line art does add contrast. So what I like to do is re-ink it just selectively. There's some areas that are going to need a little bit of clarification, that are going to need a little bit of cleaning up, but a good rule of thumb is that if it is an underside of something, like the underside of her skirt, or maybe the bottom of one of the curls of her hair, you may want to re-ink that for clarity. And what that's going to do is the lighter inks that got kind of obscured with layers of watercolor, those are going to read as kind of a highlight, and the darker, newer layers of ink are going to kind of read as a shadow. So it's really just going to reinforce what we're trying to do here with this illustration, with creating light and creating shadow. And you know how it is, you've taken a break, your eyes have had a chance to refresh, you're coming to it with new eyes, and oh look, you see a couple of areas that you want to kind of tweak just a little bit. So when all of that has dried, it is time to pull out the white gouache. And gouache is just opaque watercolor paint that is handled a little bit more thickly. I'm working with a really small, fine round here, and I'm basically just using white gouache to add like a little bit of highlight to the top of her hat, maybe to add some delineation on that J feather, to add some little highlights and sparkles to her eyes and to her hair, to add just a touch of white highlight to the scales on the fly agaric, just that sort of thing. It's really what you think looks good and what makes you happy. Different artists are going to have different techniques for how they like to add highlights. So if you're looking for some inspiration for that, I highly recommend you check out manga, because they do a really good job with that. And you can find a lot of inspiration with both manga, and then also Japanese alcohol marker art tends to have a lot of really cute ideas for how to add rim lighting. I thought her skirt looked kind of plain, so I decided to do a little design in white gouache, starting along the bottom. So I'm just doing this little dot pattern along the bottom, and then I'm kind of turning that into a scallop lace look going upward into the dress. And I'm kind of just sketching it in with dots that I'm going to fill in with more dots later. And then I'm going to add kind of a dot pattern to her dress as well, because it just kind of lightens it up a little bit. It makes it a little bit more fun. It's a little bit of surface pattern. It makes it a little less boring. You could do whatever you want with this. You can decide not to add a pattern if you're happy with it. You could add a surface design like a plaid or a floral pattern to her dress earlier on if you want to. If you're coloring along with me, it is your ship. Feel free to steer it in whatever direction you want it to go. And now we have completed another start to finish, sketch to finished watercolor illustration together. Thank you guys so much for drawing, inking, and painting along with me. If you just feel like coloring, one more reminder that I shared the printable line art over on my Patreon. please feel free to download it and digitally color it, or download it and print it out in whatever media you like. And if you share it online, please consider tagging me at Nattosoup, Nattosoup, because I would love to see what you did with this. I had a lot of fun creating this spooky season illustration that's not too spooky, and I hope you guys had some fun hanging out with me today. I hope this was helpful, useful, and informative, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Halloween season. Thank you so much to my amazing patrons who make tutorials like this one possible. You guys are the best.